And we're back, and it's COMP392, Advanced Graphics, and it's week 6. It's not part 1, part 3. It's just part 1. I'll fix that later on, but it's actually part 3. And wow, we just did this little quiz that threw me off. I was expecting it to be better, and it happens sometimes when you do this kind of stuff. But let's talk about Object 3D and what the hell that is, right? Because that is your base class, right? So if I was going to go to the 3JS website, so if I go to 3JS Lambert, what? 3JS, here we go. And if I was to look at the documentation, right? In here, it talks about your lights, your loaders, everything you need to make things go. In fact, I also included, remember, a book as an option for you guys to get to help you. So this is the website where you get all of your documentation. So if you want to try and do something, this is it. The problem with this website, I just have to say, is it's not always up to date relative to the latest version of 3JS, right? Some of the examples here may not work with the latest version, and you have to be careful about that because this is a continuously growing and changing kind of environment, right? So here's the core. If you look at the core stuff that we have to look at, things like the clock, the event dispatcher, phase 3, geometry, object 3D, raycaster, and so on. Object 3D, if you look at it, is the base class for all your scene graph objects, right? That's what this is. And that means that every object has ID, every object has UUID. We talked about this last day, actually. You know, a name, the parent, child, and so on. All these things exist for all of your objects in, you know, in your scene graph. The scene graph is like in your scene itself, which is a container object. Right? All your other objects have these attributes. So that's one thing I wanted to kind of review and talk about that. And we kind of did that last week when I created an empty object. I made an empty object with Object 3D. We actually did that as an example. Remember, I did just to remind you what we did. I put a cube in the middle of the screen, and then I attached an empty object to the cube, and then along with the empty object, I included another object, which was a smaller cube, right? Remember that? Okay. The best way, of course, to visualize this stuff is to use something like Blender. So let's do it in Blender this time around to help you, again, understanding. Part of this is understanding, right? These building blocks we're building up. We talked about this last day. Some of the stuff we talked about last day was about creating a TypeScript definition library for something that doesn't exist. You want to use the 3JS library, and it's not part of the standard 3JS library. We've used this first-person controls library. We kind of made a type definition for it with the declare statement and so on. By the way, am I going to test you on that? There's no quiz next week, right? For sure, 100%, because next week we have day 1 would be a little bit more review, right? Day 2 is going to be the test, right? So there's no quiz next week for day 1. So I fully expect that most of you are going to just skip class. Day 1, which would be a really bad thing to do because we're going to be talking about more about the quiz and more review, and also want to take a look at your stuff, like your assignment number 2. It would be nice to take a look at that to give you a little bit of feedback. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So I've got my object here in Blender. This is what it would be like in the scene in 3JS. And again, I'll move my camera out of the way for a second. Okay, so don't worry about my camera's not looking at the scene. But here, in this particular case, I've got my object, and I'm going to zoom into it. You see it's a cube, right? And I can add an empty object just like I could in 3JS. And the way to do that, of course, is Shift-A. And then if you notice, I have the option to add a bunch of different things. And one of them is empty. Now, here in Blender, it allows you to add things like plane axis, almost like the axis helper idea, right? Arrows, single arrow, circle, cube, sphere, cone, image. You can add a whole bunch of empty objects that have nothing, that actually don't render on the scene itself. They're just helper objects for us a lot of times. Sometimes it's just a container for us to contain other objects or group things together, right? Like an example is when you made your assignment number 1, you made your man in assignment number 1. You can use an empty object to group every other object together if you wanted to. And then that object would have its center based on the total geometry of all the objects, right? But let's take a look at this. So if you look at if I look at plane axis, so here's my plane axis, and it's called empty. If I move that around, you just see these plane axis, right? So in 3JS, right, you don't see this, right? But in Blender, here in the viewport, we can look at it and we know that there's an empty object that's sitting here, right? Remember parent-child relationships in Blender, we click on the object first, and then the object we want to parent to. So if I want to parent this object to this one, right? So here as I'm parenting one object to the other, right? And if I press Control P, right, it says parent to object, right? Now, if you notice, there is no more cube. It's just the empty object that we see in the scene. And underneath that, nested within this empty object, this one here, is the cube object, right? And what this does is, if I move this one, now the cube object moves with it, because the cube's global, or the cube's local space, or the coordinate space, is relative to the empty object's space. And I'll show you this. If I drag out the numeric control, the numeric panel here, and if I go up to the transform, notice that the empty object has a coordinate of 0 something, 4 point something, whatever. If I move to the middle, so I'll put it at 0, 0, thank you for that. If I go to 0, 0, 0, there it is. Now you can see that it's the empty object sitting in the middle of world coordinate space. So world space, empty object in the middle, right? Think about this as your object 3D, okay, to understand 3D. And now I've got this object, right? So here it is. Notice that relative to my parent object, right? My child object also sits at location 0, 0, 0, right? In the global space, right? Global space. So how do I see, does anyone know how to see local space right here as opposed to just the global space? How do I turn on global space so I can see the global, the local or global spacing here? Yeah. Where is it? What do you mean? Where is it? I'm clicking on this one, and I'm clicking in the transform over here, right? So if I look over here and I click on this, and if I click over here, on the left here, where does it show the local and coordinate space? Right? Because everyone's, your version of it might be
on the right side.
On this side.
Yeah, the median.
Right?
Location.
Where? Come, show me over here. Remember, I'm also using Mac and you're using Windows. I may be slight differences. Where you see it?
See this thing. Now if you
yes. And we don't see that because my version doesn't show global local right here. Yours does, right? But if you do, if you actually click on that global and local space, you can see the difference in coordinate spaces. Okay, so I just wanted to show you this so you can see the difference. There's one and there's the other, right? So there's two different things. If I grab this thing, notice that this one here, even though it has a transform, location and rotation and scale, which every object has location, rotation and scale.
So do one thing.
Yes.
Click on that plus sign on the cube. And
in the hierarchy, yes, yes.
So yeah, click on this. Click,
yes.
Click on that.
Oh yes, yes. That's different. That's the mesh you're looking at here. That's different. See how the mesh is highlighted, right? That's different than highlighting the cube itself, right? Every object, that's the container object, and this is the mesh that the object is containing, right? So, but it's good. It's good that you see local and global. So local is, if I go to global coordinate space, notice that the global space for this object is sitting at -4.50126, right? That's the y coordinate, although it sits on the x and z coordinates at 0, right? So if I wanted to move this in global space, and if I move this to -3, right, I can move it a little bit closer relative to the center, right? But if I go back to the cube object itself, so if I click on the, or left click as an example on my empty, right? And then right click on my cube, now you can see it's still showing 0, 0, 0. And it's deceiving because this 0, 0, 0 is relative to the parent, right? The parent's object. Globally though, if I click on the global, if I go to local scale, it's at 1.50126. Global, it's -3, right? For this actual object, right? Local scale means that I'm 1.5 units away from the center, and the center of my world is my empty object. People have a problem understanding that local and global space. I want you to think about local space of an object as almost like an invisible plane. All right. So notice that. Let me attach a plane here that we're going to make around this particular object, this empty object here, right? So let me do that. I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to add in another mesh, which is going to be a plane. Here's my plane. And my plane, I'm going to make it, again, I'm going to parent it to my empty object. So I'm going to click my plane here in the outliner, and then I'm going to click my empty object by shift clicking, right? And then I'm going to, in my viewport, Control P, right? And I'm going to kind of marry it to this object. Now, this empty object does two things. It has a plane and a cube. So think about this plane, and I'm going to make the plane bigger so you guys can see it, right? So I'm going to click on the plane object, right? Just the plane object, and I'm going to scale the thing out, right? So it's big. This is the this space here is the local coordinate space, right? As an example, for the entire world that the cube lives in. Think about this plane as actually as the space itself. So if I move my object, yeah, undo that. If I move my empty object around, right, then everything else should follow, including the center of the world, right? The center of the world for this object has changed. So that means if I rotate my empty object, so if I rotate it, you know, as an example on the x-axis, you know, by 30 degrees, so too does the everything rotates for my cube. My cube is relative to my empty object. Everything is relative to my empty object. This is the new world. The world is rotated. It's on a slant. But as far as the cube knows, if I was to look at the cube geometry here, so if I click on cube, right, and I looked at my my coordinates and my rotation, there's no rotation because the cube hasn't rotated. The whole world for the cube has rotated, and the whole world for the child is the parent. Yeah, that's what I want you to think of it. I don't know if there's a better way of saying that for you guys, but you need to understand that because when you have a parent-child relationship, it can mess you up in terms of how everything pairs together. All right, so I want you to try this. I want you to rebuild your little man that you did for assignment 1, right? But very, very simply, I want you to put some cubes together, and I want you to do that, and I want you somehow to group them together under one parent object, one, you know, empty object. And the trick to do this properly is to keep the empty object in the middle of the global coordinate space. All right, this is the way to do it. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to make a new, try this out for yourself, a new startup file. Let's keep the scene in the camera, and then I'm going to get rid of my cube for a second and add it afterwards. Okay, so there's nothing in the scene. I'm going to add a new empty object. So I'm going to say Shift A, and I'm going to add an empty object. Here he is, right? And we're going to make it plane axis like this again. Okay, I'm going to rotate my scene so I can see my X and Y and Z coordinates here. This is the arrows, right? And I'm going to rename my empty object as my cube man. I'm just going to change the name here. And I don't have a cube man yet, but I will. It's going to be called cube man. What about this? Cube man. There we go. There's my cube man, and you can see that over here. It's just called cube man. Well, there's no cube man yet, right? I want to add stuff to this empty object as a container object, right? So easiest thing to do, of course, is to add everything, make my man the way I want it to be, and then add all of those components by shift-clicking all those components to the empty object as the parent of those components. Okay, let's try this together. And it's better to do it all at once. All right, so I'm going to say Shift A, and let's add a very simple man. We'll add a cube. And you know what? I want this cube to be the head of the man. Let's undo here, and let's just scale this. So we'll make because it's going to be a really blocky looking guy. Okay, there's the head. And we'll add another one. We'll Shift D to duplicate that one along the Z-axis. He'll be here, so that's going to be his chest. We'll make them a little bit separate. There we go. And we'll add in another cube. So Shift D along the Y-axis. Sorry, along the Z-axis. I meant maybe along the X-axis. Along the X-axis. There we go. X-axis. And we'll add that in, and then Shift D along the X-axis. We'll put this over here. So there's part of them, right? And now, you know what? I want to shrink these objects in. So maybe I would undo that one and shrink this one first. So I'll say scale. I'll say scale, and I'll scale in completely like this, and maybe move this too much. scale in maybe more like this for his shoulder, and I'll move this up here. And again, I'm doing it rough. Let's look at from the top. That means I got to bring up my keyboard to do this properly. By the way, this isn't any kind of, we're not doing any modeling here. All we're doing is moving blocks around, right? So if I was to look at things from the top, okay, so here's the top of my cube, and I'm going to go into ortho mode and kind of go into more of a space build here. And then you can see how that shape is there for the shoulder, and I'm not quite happy with the coordinate space. And Shift D and around the x-axis and drag it out to this side. There we go. There's his big shoulders for the guy's head, right? You can see how that looks right now on the front. And scroll out. There we are, it's big shoulders. And you know what? I want to add another cube for the pelvis, or the smaller, but maybe a little bit smaller. So I'm going to Shift D. I'm going to pull it down across the Z-axis, so it kind of goes here, but let's make it a little bit smaller so it kind of scales in a little bit here relative to his size, and then like this. And you know what? There's going to be some cubes coming out here for his legs, right? Maybe one cube for his hip, another one for this hip, and then might as well, you know, select this one. So Shift D, and then I'm going to, that's duplicate again, along the Z-axis. I'm going to bring it down here, and you know what? Drag it in a little bit, and let's just bring it out to this part, right? For his, he's going to be like a very odd-looking person, but that's okay. And we'll just drag that in a little bit more. And there's his, he's more like a robot. There we go. And then Shift D along the X-axis over here. And that's put right there. So then now we can put the legs straight down if I want to. And Shift D, and I'll put this down here along the Z-axis. There we go. And then let's make it so that we scale it. So we'll scale it along the Z-axis. So make it more of this kind of thing now, which I know some of you have done. So you did kind of something, some of you did something like this, and then Shift D along the X-axis so that we'll move it like this. There we go. And then here we go. This one, I asked you guys to make an arm that goes this way. So Shift D along the X-axis, which is here. And then Shift D, I shall scale that so it goes a little bit in, because the shoulder's a little bigger than the arm. And then I'll scale that across the X-axis so that it stretches this way. And then we'll move it to this, right? And that's a little bit too big. Let's scale it along the X-axis again, just so that's a little bit less big. There we go. Da, da, da. Excellent. All right, so let's Shift D along the X-axis, and we're going to go over here like this, right? And it's probably not exactly what I'm looking for, but it's pretty close. So maybe the head's a bit too big too. Let's look at it from the front again. Relative to everything else, I'll scale in. There we go. And then move this down a little bit. I'll maybe put a neck. So Shift D, went down here like this along the Z-axis. Scale in. I'm gonna put this down here as long as it doesn't overlap. Maybe move the head up a little bit bigger, a little bit more like this. So that's too big, the neck. Scale in a little bit more and move this down. It's got a skinny neck. There we go. Skinny neck. But he looks more humanoid. Very quick job. There's obviously things you can do to make this way better, right? And I'm sure you guys did a better job on this one than I did, but that's okay because it meets some of the requirements for my man that I want to show you today, right? Okay, cool. I want to, you know, select all my cubes, right? Notice that there's a bunch of cubes here, and I want to use the outliner for this because if I do Shift A or Control A or press A to highlight everything, I'll also get the lamps and the camera, and also my empty object, which I don't want, right? So I'm going to grab all this, and I'm going to grab this cube, and I'm going to shift click all these objects in the outliner one at a time, right? As an example, so there all the objects are shift clicked, and then finally my last object, which is the cube man. Shift click there. I'm going to make that my parent. So I'm going to Control P, right? And I'm going to parent that to that object. So now my cube man is the parent object of all those other ones. And I did that pretty quick as an example, right? But now, if I undo everything, or if I unconnect, notice that I have these wires. Look at the wires. There's all these wires that are connecting me to this center object. Now, if I was to do it this way, here's a question for you, and I can undo this thing. If I rotate him, where is he going to rotate? Is he going to rotate it around here?
No.
How about maybe down here, right? So if I was to rotate now, this cube man, I'm clicking on the cube man to rotate. If I press R for rotate, as an example, so again, inside the viewport, right? And let's put it into perspective so you can see it now, what it looks like in perspective mode, right? If I click the cube man and I move them up and down, this thing moves up and down too, right? All the objects now are linked to the cube. If I right click this cube and move this over here, it can move independently, but it's still relative to the cube man. The cube man empty object, if I move this, the arm still moves with it because even though it's detached, it's still there, right? So, but if I want to rotate this one, so when I click on the cube man object and I'll press R for rotate, notice that if I rotate across the x-axis now, he'll rotate this way. The whole man will rotate on the axis, right? This is how it's going, okay? And if I rotate, undo that, if I rotate across and I press the z-axis, then he'll rotate the way we want him to rotate, right? That's by dragging this around. So that's rotating around the z-axis, right? Undo. And if I rotate around the y-axis, right, then he'll kind of go this way. Right, so he can, but notice where it's rotating, he's rotating right around this coordinate space here, right? But that's not really what I want, yeah? I want the cube man to rotate somewhere in the middle, right? This is okay to do, by the way. If you did this somehow, like if that was your solution, that would have been fine. I didn't tell you to rotate him around the center, right? I never said anywhere. I didn't tell you to rotate him around any axis, right? So your solution would have been perfectly fine like this. But let's say this isn't your solution. I'm going to undo, and I'm going to undo, and I'm going to undo, and undo, and undo, and undo. And notice now there is no association with the cube man. The cubes are all outside of the cube man again. But I want to move it relative to this space, right? So there's a couple of ways to do that. One, I can unclick or shift click this cube man and then look at where the existing center is. Take a look at that, right? Now here's a trick in Blender, and this is one thing you could do. Remember I told you can use Blender to give you the coordinates for things in 3JS and map them one-to-one almost. And you could do that. So notice how my cursor is way out here, right? My cursor is way over here. So what I want to do, if you look at it, this space that it's giving me, because all of these objects are selected at the same time, right? The exact, where my manipulator arms are is the exact center of my man right now, the way I've drawn him, or her, who knows what it is, right? Androgynous. And I have this cursor out here. I can press Shift S, right? And what I could do is I could say cursor to selected. Cursor to selected would actually put my cursor right in the middle of this object, right? Cursor to selected. Now my cursor is in there, right? That's cool. And now I can select my cube man empty object, and I can press Shift S, where I can say selection, right, to cursor. So now my cube man is physically inside that middle space, right? So now he's in the middle, this cube man empty object. All right, cool. Now I'm going to get all these other objects just like I did before. So I'm going to click this one and shift click, all these other objects. Again, this is not modeling. This is just moving things around. There we go. And I want to finally shift click. The last one will be the cube man empty object. And then I'm going to press Control P, right? And I'm going to say to object. Now you can see that there's only the cube man object around. And if I press A, notice that if I click the cube man object now, right? So and if I move them around, it still moves from the middle. But the middle of my object now, right? My cube man object is the middle of my geometry. This is another way you could have done your assignment number 1, right? You could have done this. Let's move the actual cube man object to the middle of my screen. I'm going to press, so it's 0 to the middle of world space, 0, 0, 0, and that is the center of the world for him, for the cube man. You may have done this. By the way, you may have done it so that you grouped all the objects together as well too. That's the other way to do it, right? Or here's another way people have done it. And I've seen this as well. You made a cube that is outside of the entire cube, but it's transparent, and you put the cube man inside that cube. People have done that too for some reason, which is kind of weird, but also satisfies the requirements. Okay, so here's my cube man, and now I want to rotate him. I want to rotate the cube man around the z-axis. Notice that he'll still spin, but he spins right from the middle, right from the middle. And if I rotate him around the x-axis, he also moves this way from the middle of himself as opposed to his feet, because his whole world is relative to the empty object that he's a child of, right? And the same thing goes with if I rotate him across the y-axis, you can see that he rotates kind of around his center. That's the center of the geometry, the geometry of the man. Any questions around this? So 2 ways you could have done it. Who did it the first way, where you kind of paired everything to an empty object on the ground somewhere, right? And then rotated it. Anybody? All right.
No, I grouped them together.
You grouped them together, and then they had a center because of the grouping, yeah?
Actually, I can't say that, but I grouped them together.
And then what did you rotate?
I rotated that group.
The group, right? And when you rotate the group, where does the center of that group?
It's center of the legs.
On the bottom, right? Like I showed you, right? Depending on where you put it, you set the center of the group because where your location is, right? Wherever the location of the group is the location of the center of rotation, right? Okay. What about who did it the other way? Who grouped it so that it's in the exact center of the person? Anybody? Huh? Well, like this, something like this. Did anyone do this? How about another solution? Who did it another way, where you rotated all the cubes individually? Did you do that? Yeah. That's harder. That's harder to do because then you have to calculate where, if this one rotates, then this one has to rotate relative to the other one, right? So you have to create a relationship, but it's not a parent-child relationship, although you could have, right? Like I could have made parent-child relationships for all these things. Like for example, I could have made this one here, the center cube, my parent, and I could have made this one the child, and this one the child, and this one the child, and this one the child, right? And then from these ones, from this hip area, this would be the child, and this would be the child. And then from this leg area, this is the child, and from this leg area, this is the child. I could have done that too. I made multiple parent-child relationships. Actually, that's more like a bone structure, right? If you think about it, there's bones. If you want to make the bones, backbone of a character, it's very similar to that parent-child relationship, right? I'm not going to comment on which way is better way. For the user, so to me, it's all about user experience, right? So if the user sees what I've asked you to do and it rotates, like I've asked you in different directions, and it changes color and blah, blah, I'm okay with it. So I've never told you how to do it. I just told you this is my result, right? So as long as it looks okay, it looks like a man, some kind of humanoid object, right? Like for example, if I didn't have the head, right? Let's get rid of the head. And I got rid of it like this, right? Here, just question. Does that look like a man to you? Maybe a headless man, right? But something's missing, right? So then you'd lose marks if something was missing like that. If there's no head, right? Or let's say, for example, all you included was, the head, right? Here's the head, but there's no legs, right? Or one leg is missing, like this. If something's missing, right? Is that a man? Well, I mean, I guess so. It's not a two-legged man. I probably would comment on it and say, guys, I was expecting a two-legged man here. That's usually what, or an object, female, male, humanoid, right? By the way, please, I wasn't expecting anatomical correctness. So if someone put some anatomical correct, object, yes, I would laugh. But please try and keep it as simple as I've stated in the requirements, right? So really, what we're talking about here is parent-child relationships, and we can't go on with the stuff we're going to be doing after the test next week without understanding parent-child relationships, because they work exactly like this in 3JS, in Create.js, in Unity, in Unreal, in any kind of game engine or framework, any kind of thing that you've thought about. They all work relatively like this. All right, so this is part of our 3D learning idea. When we do advanced graphics, one of the course outcomes is understanding 3D, right? So this is part of understanding that. So if you don't get that, then you'll lose marks or you'll be affected by that. Okay, this is cool. Let me go back and let's ask some other questions, right? So we did this little demo. So here's a question I have for you. I want to create, I want to create a first-person object here with this my cube. And what are the two things that I need to make this first-person object really kind of work? If I was going to attach some kind of logic to it, right, so that I can walk around a scene in Blender, right? Let's talk about Blender for a second. What do I need for the person, so for the user to feel like it's a first-person controller character? Anybody? I need a camera. What else do I need? Do I need a body? Not really, right? I mean, I could include a shadow and a body, but really at the end of the day, all I need is a camera that walks around. As long as I have a camera that moves around the entire scene, I've got my first-person controller, so to speak, right? Let's not do that in this case. Here's what I want you to do in Blender. I want you to take a cube like this. I want you to scale the cube a little differently, different shapes, make it so it's more of a rectangular prism, right? And I want you to put a camera on top of its head, like on the top of it somewhere, okay? That's what I want you to do. So take a cube, change it into a rectangular prism so it's kind of standing up, like almost like that kind of shape. Put the camera on top of its head, and I want you to parent the camera. I want you to parent the camera to the cube object, all right? Let's do that. And we'll talk about the other way. What's the right way to do it? Should I parent the camera to the cube, or should I parent the cube to the camera? Is it? Cube to the camera. What about an empty object? And underneath that, I have a camera. Right? What's the other? That's the other object, right? So the other thing is, so this is the right way to do it. Take an empty object, parent the camera to the empty object, parent the cube to the empty object, position them together relative to each other, right? And when I move around, I want to move the empty object around, and then the cube and the other thing is going to follow it. Yeah? Okay. Try that, please. Go in Blender, and I want you to do that, and I'll do it with you. So I've got my cube, right? And what I want to do with it is I want to change the shape. Remember, S is for scaling, and I was doing that throughout the entire little demo just now, right? So if I do S for scaling, I only want to scale in one direction. So let's say I want to scale, if I want to constrain my scaling to scale only on the X-axis or only on the Y-axis, I press the S key followed by the axis I want to constrain. For example, the Y-axis. And then I can constrain my cube so that it's a little narrower. Okay, this is one way of doing it. What about if I want to constrain both the X and the Y, but not the Z? How do I do that? Is there a way of doing that? So I kind of say scale, and if I press, X on the X and then the Y, notice that I can choose both if I press the Shift key, right? Or X and Z. Did I press Z? I press Z. Undo. So scale across the X and the Y. Oh, X and the Z. There we go. On the Y. So now you can see how I select both those areas that I want to scale. There we go. So both X and Y, and only on the Z will it scale. So I can do that kind of all at once. Hey, I've got that done. And my scale, just for people who want to match up with mine, you can also do it manually. I've done probably about 0.5. Let's use a 0.5 scale for my X and my Y, just to be more accurate, and 1 for my Z, right? So, or if you want to change the dimensions, that's another way to do it. You can just change the dimensions to 1, 1, and 2, right? And that's going to give you your rectangular prism, right? That's what it is. Okay, cool. I want to put the camera on top of its head, right? And the right way to do that, first of all, is understand what the coordinate space is for X and Y. All right. So if my X coordinate goes this way, if I want to move it to the right with my arrow key to the right, and a positive move is to the right, then wherever the arrow points is the positive move. That means I've got to set up my camera so that it's facing this way, away from me, right? Okay, cool. And of course, the way to do that is, the fast way, and that I see it is, I want to put it, first of all, in the middle of my object, and then move it to the top. That's kind of the easiest way to do it, right? So one way to do it is, if you notice my cursor's in the center of my object. This is good, right? So I want to leave my cursor where it is and kind of zoom out here, right? So zoom out, grab my camera, right? And leave my other thing alone. And then just like I did before, right? I want to, this is tricky. So if I press Shift S and I want to say selection to cursor, I still retain, even though my camera is in the middle, I still retain my, my rotation. My rotation is looking like way down there, right? And I don't want that. Notice that on the rotation perspective, its X is 63 something, Y is something, and Z is something else, right? So let's change this on the, if I change the Z to 0, right? And let's just move it over here. You can see that the Z now points in this direction. And on the Y coordinate space, X coordinate, I definitely, if I put that to 0, then it points straight down, which I don't want. That doesn't make any sense that the camera is looking down at my feet, right? I want it so that the X is like 90 degrees, right? So let's try that out. So I'm gonna put the X at 90, right? There's my X is 90 for the camera. Here it is. And my Y should definitely be 0 because I don't want it to be any, there's no should be any angle. So it's 90, 0, 0. I want to move the camera on top of its head. So kind of up here, right? So that's kind of cool. I mean, my camera's here and I can't see my body, right? This is definitely one solution. Is this what I should do? Should I do it like this, where the camera is kind of at the top of the object? I'm asking a question, just so you know, right? Why would it be this and not this? Yeah, well, there's a chance here I'll see myself, right? And, you know, chances are I don't want to do that, right? Not in this coordinate space. I'm going to undo. Now, remember that it's 0, 0, and 90. You can't tell, but this is actually, if I lift it up properly so you can see it from a side view, then you can see that it's perfectly aligned to the top. That's the side view of the camera, right? By the way, guys, there's many ways to do this little trick, right? Okay, cool. I've got my two objects, and I've got my object down here. My cursor's still at the center. I haven't mashed this up at all. So now I'm going to add a new object. So Shift A. I'm going to add a new empty object. Here's my empty object. And now I got to really be careful about this, but I want to put it in the center of my object, right? Because this is where I'm going to move everything. So plane axis to the center. There it is. Okay, and now what I want to do is my empty object. I want to call this my hero. Here's my hero. And I want to take my cube, my camera, and then shift click my hero, and then Control P. And it's going to say move it to the object, right? There it is. Okay, now if I click on my hero, if I deselect all and select my hero object, right, there it is. If I move my hero up and down, my camera and my cube move around too. Okay, cool. Let's click on my cube for a second, and here's my cube. Here's my cube, and let's add and I'm clicking underneath the hierarchy here, just to let you know. Going to the right, clicking on my material. Let's change my material because it's my hero to kind of a greenish material, so I can see it. And I'm going to zoom out, and what I want to do is I want to create a plane that the hero is going to be walking around in. Okay, so the hero needs a plane to walk on, right? And by the way, we're going to use some physics here, right? So what I want to do is the hero himself, here's the hero, okay? And we did what we're supposed to. Here's the hero, and here's the two objects, the cube, mesh, and the camera object, right? I want to use the hero, right? So I'm still clicking on the hero. I want to click on physics, and I want to go from Blender render, check me out here, Blender render to Blender game, right? And I'm going to change my physics from static to character. Okay, static to character. And I want to make him an actor. All right, so click on actor as well. Okay, cool. So there's my character. He's an actor. And now I want to add a plane underneath him. So I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to add a mesh plane object. Notice that it's still here. And I'm going to pull the plane object so that it sits relatively underneath. It doesn't have to be exact. Somewhere underneath the character like this. Right? And now I'm going to pull out so we can see it more. And I'm going to scale this plane up maybe as wide or a little bit wider than the entire grid. There we go. Doesn't matter how it is. My scale, if you want to match with mine, I'm going to make it 20 by maybe 20 times. 20 and 20. Let's make it that way. From a dimension perspective, 20 and 20. And we'll make this 10 as well. There we go. Here's my plane, and here's my character. My plane, from a physics perspective, is going to stay static. And let's change the material for the plane to this kind of brownish color, right? And again, you can choose what the brown color you like to use if you have a number. I'm also going to pull down the intensity of the light that's going to be here for a little, make it a little darker. There we go. And I'll change specularity down so it's nothing. Yay. Okay. So we've got some stand-in objects here. Now, if I raise the hero up, so if I click on the, let's change the name of the plane to ground, my outliner, and if I change my hero, if I click on my hero object and raise them up here like this, remember that the camera is inside the hero. What's going to happen to the camera if everything goes as we think? It's going to look like we're falling, right? Because our view is where the hero is. Let's check this out. If I press, first of all, let's change this to material. There we are. And let's change our lighting, move it up a little bit higher, and change the light source type from a point to a spot. And just to make it more interesting looking. Spots are kind of funny this way, right? And we'll increase our intensity of the light. By the way, all of this is very similar in, we'll make it 2, so twice the intensity. Very similar in 3JS, right? There we go. Okay, and I want to play the scene, and in Blender Game, one more thing I need to do is change my shading from multi-texture to GLSL. So my shading is correct. And I want to press P for play. Okay, what happened? How come I don't see anything? How come I didn't see through the camera's eyes? How come? What's that? That's weird. That's really strange. Let's actually move into the camera's view. And if I go here and I press 0 for the camera, I do see through the camera's view. Here's what my camera sees. Let's see. So if I zone out, I'm actually seeing through the camera's view, and I'm seeing way over here, right? So I'll press N. And I need to do that first, right? Because this is where the camera is seeing out of. This is my camera. And if you look at it, as I pull out, I'm actually looking inside the person's head. So my camera is seeing something like this. That's what you should see with the camera, right? And that's the camera point of view. The camera point of view looks like this. That's the camera point of view. All right, now if I press play, right, I can see this. That's what I should see, because but my camera didn't fall. How come my camera didn't fall down or do anything? Like my camera just sat there, right? It didn't fall. Well, my question to you again is, what's the physics surrounding my, if I press escape, what's the physics surrounding my hero? My hero, does it have physics if I click on this thing? Well, no, my physics type is no collision, right? So my hero has nothing. I got to make this kind of a character, right? So this is the actual empty object, because my empty object is what everything else is paired to. Just saying. So if I press P now, hey, wait, how come it didn't fall? How come I didn't see anything? Right, well, look, I'm looking in my little world here relative to everything else. Take a look. This is what I'm looking at. So here's my camera, right? And notice how I'm way up here, and I haven't moved, even if I press P, right? How come? Let's try it again. Let's make this an actor and press P. And nothing works. I'm not falling. My character just hangs out here in this virtual space. Press P, it disappears, right? But I don't see anything. It just hangs there. Right? Because, and this is in Blender, and it might happen in 3JS as well, when you pair your camera to another object, right? Doesn't matter, and especially if an empty object. Empty object has no particular shape to it. There is no mesh assigned to it. So pairing physics and all that kind of stuff, and we're going to go into a physics section after our test next week. It doesn't respond the right way that you think it would, right? And also, from a camera perspective, can I associate, there's physics, there's also physics associated to the camera. Notice that the camera's physics is static. So let's change this to character too. So character is static, my character is here. Everything is a character now, not just the, I make this an actor. And now let's press play. And we'll go into the view of the camera for a second again. So this is the camera's view. And you're going to ask me, do you see anything in the camera? It's like kind of blank, right? So, right, this is what I see. This is what the camera sees. And why is this bad, right? Why does this not make any sense to you? You're going to look at it and go, Tom, I don't get it, right? How come I don't see anything in my camera, right? Because where does the camera see out of? Let's look at that. Where is the back part looking? It's up here, right? If I move the camera up a little bit more, let's move the camera so that it's unhidden from the box, right? And now I go to the camera view. I see this, right? I see the top of my box and a little bit of the bottom of the back of my box, right? And now if I press P for play, right? All I see is this. It's like really strange, right? What is it looking at? It's looking at way over here, right? How about if I put the camera way out here in front? So it's connected. Look at the wire. The wire is still wiring up to the actual object, right? But I'm moving the camera away from this one. Okay, now let's press play. Oops, let's go back to the camera view. This is what the camera sees now, right? Look at how this is the plane. This is the plane, right? And there's a little piece right here, right, that the camera is looking at, right? If I press play, all I see is this. Yeah. Why should I do that? I didn't have to do it before, right? I mean, I could. If you like me to, I will, right? But if I press S for scale and scale out this thing, this doesn't really, I mean, I can reverse the scale or whatever, but it's not really going to do much. If I press P for play, oh, see that? Something happened there. Wait, let's try it again. P for play. Oh, something came into the scale of the camera. Let's move this thing up. So if I was actually just to you know, kind of zoom in here to see what the camera sees, and if I press P, I see that something happened, right? Let's do a couple of things here. So I'm going to undo the scale. I'm going to go back to the camera itself and press N for scale. And notice how my my camera is still a scale of 1. And one thing to note is that I'm involved with motion tracking. That's cool, but I haven't locked my camera to view, and yet there's this like orange field here that I'm looking at. Let me just press P for play, and what happens? How come I can't see anything? Well, what's actually happening is our background is black, is kind of this gray, right? So even if I scale out from the camera, so here's what the camera is looking at, right? And I pull out to here, do I actually physically see my ground at all? No. Let's angle it so you can see the ground. So I'm going to rotate across the x-axis a little bit more so I can see my ground. Now let's look at this. Can I see my ground? No, it's still underneath me. Rotate the camera around the x-axis, right? And again, notice if I see my ground, here's my ground, okay? So I can see my ground now on the bottom of my camera. My camera's actually looking down now, all right? And if I press P for play, right, I still don't see anything. My camera doesn't see a darn thing. Any reasons why you would say that's true? Anybody? Funny thing is with Blender, just so you guys know, if you guys ever going to do anything like this with Blender, it doesn't take well to things like pairing objects to an empty object, to be honest with you. Let me look at it from another perspective, right? So here's my object. Let's move my camera object and unpair it for a second. Okay, so let's unpair the object and put my camera outside of this object that has the empty object and the cube object to see what happens just with the empty object in my cube. So I'm going to take my camera and I want to clear the parent, right? So how do I clear parent? We go object, right? And if you look at parent, I can clear parent, which is Alt P. There it is. So now my object is way down here. Here's my my camera. My camera is totally detached from the scene now, like not like before, right? So let's make it so that here's my object over here. My camera is now detached, right? And I just want to show you this for a second, right? So here's my X and Y coordinates and my Z coordinates, and I want the camera to take on a position right here behind the character, right? This is my character position. And I want the camera to see this scene. All right, so I'm going to say, I'm going to go to view, I want to go to camera, and then set active camera, right? Camera, active camera is going to go in there, right? And if I press escape or back to this view, I want to move my active camera to view, align view align active camera to view. There it is. This is my new view that I'm seeing with my camera, so I can see it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my lock camera to view. And I'm going to pull out a little bit so I can see my empty object, my object that's sitting in three-dimensional space. And I want to see if it falls down because I've applied physics. Right? My camera is now separate from it. I want you to see this. All right. Unclick this one, take away my M button, and now press play. It happened because my camera, even though I've detached it, my camera itself, if I look at my camera object, has a physics type of character. Let's make it so that there's no collision or static. And if I press P for play, now it's gone. What happened to my cube? See, it went like right into the air somewhere. Let's watch it again. So take a look at my cube, right? No collision. And there's a reason for it, because both the empty object and my cube, right? The empty object and my cube are reacting to each other, right? They're interacting because they're inside. One's inside the other one, right? Let's go and check this out. So if I go back to my cube object and I make this no collision, right? As an example. And now remember, my hero object has character. And if I press P for play, now it falls. Okay, so this is one of our issues. So the internal objects inside of Blender, notice how it is that can't have their own physics collisions, or what's going to happen. This, by the way, works exactly the same in Fizzy.js. It also works the same in other engines. You can't have objects that can collide with each other that are paired together, right? Just by chance. I'm just letting you know, right? Okay, this is good. So that means that now I can fix my other object. So I'm going to press escape. I'm going to go down to here. And I'm going to go over here to this, right? And what I want to do is I want to move my camera so it's relative to my object. And again, one of the easiest way to do this is, again, align my view with the way I want it, right? Here's my view. And I want to align my camera to the view. So I'm going to kind of go to here. This is where I want my camera to appear, right here, approximately. And what I want to do is I want to press, go to view. I'll take a short break in a second. I'll go to view and I'll align active camera to view. There it is. Notice that I don't see anything here because if I zoom away, my camera is way out here. This is where my camera is. Take a look, right? And when it falls, right now it doesn't see anything, right? Okay, but we should see it fall down in a second, and I'm going to do that. I'll leave this where it is right now, but I'm going to pair this one to my hero object, just like we did before. So pair this one. So here's shift click, and then control P again, pairing that back in there with my object. There's my camera. And now if I press P, notice that it falls, right? If I go to my object view, and I'm not going to lock my camera to view anymore, right? Let's get rid of N, and let's get rid of T to give myself more space. This is what the camera sees right now. And let's press P, right? See how that fell? So not only did the object fall, but the camera fell, but the only thing that has physics attached to it is the empty object. The empty object is driving everything else to fall because we're treating that empty object as a character. And the center of that empty object is where everything's going to rotate, the camera and the character himself. Okay, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll put a little bit of logic so we can move this thing around in Blender. All right?